Hi everyone, it's Cindy. Welcome back to Studioloo. I'm here today with the first episode of Short Story Scraps. So this is going to be where I share a snippet of something and I make something with scraps. So today I want to share a little bit with you from Ian Niall, who is a wonderful nature writer. He wrote for his Countryman's Notes. He wrote for Country Life magazine for over 30 years. So today what I want to share with you is a little bit that he wrote in November and December of 1971 as part of an article called Denizens of the Countryside. So for a long time he lived in Wales, and his exploration of nature is from that point of view. So let us begin. My friend, who keeps a badger as a pet, was telling me how the creature had come to expect to be admitted to the living room where he fraternized with the family cats and did his best to establish a friendly relationship with the dog. Dogs are nervous of badgers, I think, because the badger is quite fearless. My friend said he could scold his pet, whom he calls Humbug, and the badger would stop knocking ornaments off a shelf or poking his nose into some article of furniture he hadn't examined before. But if the reprimand took the form of a slap on the nose, Humbug counterattacked immediately. The relationship had briefly been interrupted when Humbug had left home and couldn't be found for a couple of days. This desertion may have had something to do with a temporary shortage of baby food, upon which at this time Humbug had been accustomed to being fed. By a strange chance, Humbug was located when a telephone call summoned my friend to the home of the local district nurse. Humbug had been scratching at her door. It seemed that he had scented his staple food, which the district nurse kept in bulk in a store cupboard. While a badger makes a fascinating pet, it has a bear-like blundering way that can hardly be curbed. At tea time, my friend says Humbug will arrive at the table, rear up and put his strong black forefeet on the edge of the table and expect to be fed. Once he's part of the family, the rule is that everyone has equal rights and must share and share alike. How can such a pet be returned to the wild and successfully rehabilitated? The responsibility of taking him into the family is a heavy one, for it is doubtful that his own kind will accept him once he is cast out. So that's an interesting story. I can't imagine keeping a badger as a pet. But yeah, I guess it really speaks to how careful we need to be as wildlife rehabbers and people who encounter wildlife out in the wild. We always have to be thinking about, both the legal bylaw kind of side of things, but also what's in the best interest for the animal. I've known a lot of people throughout my life who have taken in wild animals to try to, kind of rehab them without any experience to try to just do the right thing by the animal. But I think oftentimes a young animal is a lot different than how they're going to age and what they're going to need as they get older. And honestly, how we as people impact their lives. So it's definitely a big decision. And I think, I've spent a lot of time doing volunteering, and somehow throughout my life, animals always find me when they're in a hard spot. So these days, my first reaction is always to call a professional. When I was younger, I think I would have taken some more liberties because, I think we're all impacted by cute, so cute, want to keep it cute, right? It's that whole mama, can I keep it mentality. But I'm not like that anymore as an adult, and I'm teaching my own children much different about like how we don't meet our own needs first, right? We need to meet the needs of the animal that's in trouble, that's experiencing being hurt or abandoned or something like that. So we want to make sure they have a functional, normal life. Also noted in this story that he talks about how the badger would turn on him if he were to hit him on the nose. Well, one thing a lot of people don't realize is that, especially with dogs, you should never hit an animal on the snout because they have a lot of nerve endings in their snout. And if you're not, I never hit animals to begin with, and I certainly don't recommend it as a way to control an animal or teach them anything, because just like with children, it does the very opposite. It just teaches fear and pain and isolation. So with the snout, however, it can actually be fatal to a dog if you were to hit them very hard in the snout, because they have a lot of nerve endings and it can be very shocking for their system. So just something to be made aware of. So now I think we'll move on to the story from December of 1971, a month later from this badger tale. And we're here talking now, it looks like, about walnut trees and what's going on. The leaves haven't gone from our walnut trees, but the nuts have. In other years, we always had walnuts, but this year a gray squirrel came down and explored the outermost branches of each tree, taking the nuts one by one. He carried them off to bury them when he didn't mismanage the thing and let them fall into the long grass. Occasionally, he would pose on the asbestos ridge of the garage and gnaw at a walnut, trimming the green ball as he expertly turned in his paws until it was all eaten or reduced to fine chips. The whole crop went in about 3 or 4 days. I could have discouraged the squirrel with a gun, but he was so impudent that I couldn't bring myself to harm him. Between whiles, he went down to the duck's run and helped himself to bread fragments, which I had scattered among the barley in the feeding dish. The duck, I could see, was apprehensive of this bold rat-like visitor. It looked at him, stretching its neck about 1/2 inch from the ground and never taking its eyes from him. The squirrel ignored the poor duck. When he had had his fill, he would scamper off up the path, returning about the same time next day, taking bread after eating the green walnuts. On the final day, 2 squirrels were there. They haven't shown up since. They must know that the harvest is over. There isn't a nut left on any of their trees. Humbug, the badger I mentioned not long ago, was given his freedom and released in a wood some miles away from the household in which he had received the infant nurture. For days, although the friend who released him had visited the wood and called his pet's name, Humbug buried himself in the depth of the larches and didn't show face. As badgers are nocturnal animals, this wasn't really surprising. If he had excavated a hole for himself, he was probably lying below ground, snug in bracken or hay, which he could have gathered on the adjoining rough ground. Once Humbug had gone walkabout and trundled round the village for a while, but now he would revert to the wild, distracted from his daily routine by the intrusion of humans, rather than be attracted by them as he was when he was living in their midst. The other day, the first report of Humbug's homing was received. He had been heard scratching at the door of a house at the other end of the straggling village. He had been seen in the half-light. Soon, my friend fears, he will be knocking at the door to bring about a speedy reunion. My friend would go about calling his pet's name by night, but he is just a little self-conscious about the whole thing. What would a stranger think, coming upon a man in the dark who continually called Humbug? So that was a cute little reference to, Scrooge, right, with Humbug. My grandfather used to eat the candies Humbugs all the time, and I think as a result of my grandparents being such Humbug fans, I'm also quite a big Humbug fan myself. I pick them up every now and then when I see them. But this whole story about squirrels, honestly, it makes me laugh because we have had... So every now and then you'll have what's called a mast year, where the oak trees produce far more, like by probably 3 or 4-fold times, the number of acorns that they normally would provide. And so during those years, it's normal for the following year you'd have kind of a bumper crop of squirrels as well, because they've been able to have extra babies and have more seasons where they could nest and breed and all of that because of all of that food. So we had that 2 years ago, and last year was like a squirrel apocalypse in my backyard. We actually had to protect our bird feeder and put up some wire over our garden and fencing and those sort of things because they were so much. But yeah, it seems to have resolved itself. I think eventually, when the population of squirrels is so high that there's a lot of conflicts going on, which there was, I was noticing a lot of chasing, aggressive kind of behaviors with them. They would run along our fence line. They sort themselves out. They expand their territory, I think. I know there's probably a bit of human intervention too. Some people are a little more emotional about their property and their garden than others, and will, deal with it in some way. But I still remember I had like squirrels, specifically baby squirrels. You need to be a little careful if you try to help them when they're little. This again goes back to my advice to call a professional, because when I was a kid, I was babysitting these kids who lived in my town just up the road from where I lived, and the neighbor was outside mowing his lawn. And so all of a sudden, this little tiny squirrel came running out of nowhere and ran right up his body and sat on his shoulder, and then ran right down his body, and then did the same thing to me, ran right up my body from my foot all the way up my leg, up my side, up my arm, and sat on my shoulder. But it stayed with me. So I think I was probably 14 at the time. The kids were like losing their minds over this, like, oh my gosh, we have a baby squirrel. So I didn't have the best judgment at that time. And so I brought it into the house and began to nurture it and mother it. And then I suddenly realized, what am I going to do with this? So I called my dad to find out what to do. And he said, he'd wander up to see what was going on. So he took it with him down to my parents' house to try to figure out what to do, to see if it was hurt or anything. And then he called me back to say, look, we have to let this squirrel back outside because it's bitten your mother. And I'm like, okay. So that's fine. Okay. So then I came home from babysitting, and it was time, to let this squirrel go. So where I found, or where it seemed to have come from, was the neighbor's house next to where I babysat. Was the home of this man. He used to own a collector plate store in the building that my father lives in. And he was a nice man, I'd say, quite well-to-do, quite quiet, quite not in the mood for kids or teens, and happy to live a very sort of, I'd say, interesting life of someone who sells collector plates and Royal Dalton figurines and such expensive kind of things, right? Tchotchkes of when I was a kid. So I was always very polite to him because, I don't know, when you're a kid, you sort of look at, for me, the adults that were in my family and that I knew were kind of like your more casual, domestic type adults. But then there's as a kid, you sort of translate certain kinds of people as almost like an aristocracy. They have an air of importance about them. There's some other kind of this is how the other half lives. And he had a beautiful, massive Victorian home, gorgeous, worth several $1 million today, in the town that I lived in. And so his wife was a very mean-spirited lady. He was cordial to me, but his wife did not like me at all because I was like this. I grew up in this town. I was kind of a kid who liked to go into the pond and get dirty, and I think she looked at me kind of like a dirt kid who was looking for trouble, and she probably wasn't too far off. But she had these two dogs. They were miniature wiener dachshunds, mini dachshunds, little tiny long wiener dogs, and they were long haired, and they were both obnoxiously vicious. Just do not get close to them because they will start yapping and they will definitely bite you, definitely your ankles. And so I always was told by my parents to keep my distance from both her and her dogs because, my parents were navigating the relationship of their tenants, and they have this shop in our building, and also they don't particularly like kids, and we know that, so let them be, right? So I abided by that all the time. So we had to bring the squirrel back to their house and try to put it back in their backyard where they had a massive chestnut tree, and that's where it came from. Its family was there. We walked back and went to the house where I'd been babysitting and told them what we were doing so that we didn't just trespass onto the property of the neighbors, the grouchy plate neighbors. So Eventually, though, they saw us. They saw us trying to put this squirrel there, because what would happen is we would put it on the edge of the property and then we would walk away. And then it would just follow us. It would run right after us. So we had to get craftier. So like we would try to take him to the tree all the way, put him on the tree, and then run away. But he would follow us again. So eventually the man came out of his house and he's like, "What are you doing?" So he explained, what we were trying to do. So he suggested we put the squirrel in the tree and then we run into his house, which was a little closer, and we exit through the front door so the squirrel wouldn't see us. Well, it eventually worked, but it took like 4 or 5 tries, and it was so completely awkward the whole time. I completely hated the whole thing, because I could tell the wife, who was like sitting with her vicious dog in her lap, she was just looking at me like, "What ridiculous nonsense are you bringing into my home, right? Like, what have you gotten yourself into that you can't resolve?" So, what I also forgot to mention is, like, a few months before that, the worst thing ever happened to me with this lady. So I used to hang around. There was a convenience, like a little candy shop, little convenience store in my town. And it was like the candy store to me. So they had outside a little fruit stand, and it was kind of like an outdoor, like front pergola kind of thing. And it was held up by these 2 metal bars that the roof kind of laid on top of for the outdoor fruit market part of it. And for some reason, I used to want to always swing on these 2 bars. Like, I would hold on to this bar and I would swing around it like it was like a pole, right? I would swing around it. And so one day when the grumpy lady with her wiener dogs, was walking by to check the mail, I didn't see her, and I was swinging around this thing, and I had my arm dangerously extended as long as it could go, and it was swinging around me into the sidewalk. Well, if it did not connect with her abdomen one day, and, she was probably in her late 60s, not super old, but old enough to not want to be slugged by some doofus, like 9-year-old goofing around outside. And it was like a hard hit, because I was like flying on this pole. So she kind of made this out of breath sound, and then like sort of shirked something at me that I didn't really hear, and she did not want to talk about it, and she just marched on her really frustrated way, carrying her mail with her dogs barking their heads off. So I never told anyone about that at all, because I was like, I'm not getting in trouble for that. Like, I remember shouting like, "I'm sorry," but she was just like, "Whatever, kid," So yeah, don't collect baby squirrels, because they're really hard to disconnect from when you want to. That's my PSA for today. Thank you for joining me for this little short story scraps. I hope you liked this one. Let me know what you think. I think this is kind of a fun way to just talk to you guys, but have sort of like a way to prompt myself based on things I'm reading, because I really connect with like nature experiences and nature study. It's a big part of what I love doing. I've loved doing my whole life, and I think it's a good way to kind of talk to you guys and do a little creative stuff at the same time. Okay, until next time, have a lovely day. Bye for now.